Louis XIV and Versailles, Power, Love and Intrigue. In this amazing video, we will tell you about the spicy sex life of Louis XIV, the rise and fall of Versailles. Stay tuned to uncover the incredible story of Louis XIV, the Sun King, a ruler so powerful he named himself after the blazing star that gives life, so dominant he forced even the proudest nobles to bow to his command, so passionate that no single mistress could ever hold his heart for long. A life of grandeur, the vision of Louis XIV. Throughout his extraordinary and eventful life, King Louis XIV pursued magnificence in every aspect of his reign. Whether in love, war, or the arts, he was driven by an insatiable desire to display his power and grandeur. Yet above all, Louis XIV dreamed of creating a symbol of his unmatched authority, Versailles, a palace unlike any the world had ever seen. His ambition was clear: to build a residence so opulent, so extravagant, that it would outshine every other royal palace on earth. From the towering gardens to the lavish interiors, Versailles was designed to be the ultimate representation of the Sun King's glory and absolute power. It was not just a royal residence, it was a statement of France's dominance and Louis XIV's vision of divine rule. The birth of Versailles. Drawn from personal memoirs, royal letters, and official chronicles, this is the extraordinary tale of how one king's relentless obsession gave rise to one of the greatest wonders of the world, the Palace of Versailles. It's a story of power, ambition, and vision unlike any other in history. It all began not in splendor, but in a swamp, a damp, mosquito-ridden stretch of marshland where the young, 27-year-old King of France dared to dream the impossible. Near a small and rather unremarkable village called Versailles, he envisioned a palace that would outshine every court in Europe, a place that would reflect the glory of his reign and the divine image of his monarchy. From that moment, Versailles became more than just a royal residence. It was the stage on which the drama of absolute power unfolded. Every stone, every garden, every mirror in its legendary Hall of Mirrors was born from the king's determination to transform mud into majesty. The impossible vision. His courtiers were far from impressed. To them, the king's choice seemed reckless, even absurd. Versailles was nothing more than a swampy wasteland, an unworthy stage for royal grandeur. Many whispered that Louis XIV had chosen the worst possible location to prove that his will was stronger than nature itself. But behind this impossible vision lay something deeply personal. Versailles was not chosen by chance. It was once the site of his father's modest hunting lodge, a quiet refuge away from the intrigues of Paris. For young Louis XIV, it had been a place of laughter and freedom, where he could escape the weight of the crown, chase deer through the forest, and dream of the world he would one day rule. Now as king, he returned to that same place with a new purpose: to turn a childhood memory into a symbol of eternal power. What began as nostalgia soon transformed into obsession. The desire to reshape the land, to command even the elements, and to build a palace that would stand as the ultimate expression of royal will. Defying nature and building the dream. The old chateau stood on uneven ground, perched on a hill that made every plan for expansion a logistical nightmare. Engineers and advisors warned the king repeatedly that the site was far from ideal. The terrain was unstable, the soil too damp, the water scarce, and the costs astronomical. But Louis XIV, the Sun King, was not a ruler accustomed to hearing the word no to him. Obstacles were merely opportunities to prove that even nature itself could be bent to his will. Driven by ambition and an unshakable belief in his divine right to rule, Louis envisioned not just a residence, but a statement, a palace that would radiate the glory of France and his own absolute power. To bring his vision to life, he summoned the most brilliant minds of his time, including the architect Louis XIV, who was tasked with transforming the modest hunting lodge into the magnificent Palace of Versailles. As the foundations took shape, Versailles became the embodiment of a dream built on determination, artistry, and extravagance. Yet, amidst the noise of construction and the demands of court life, the king always made time for his other great passion, women. For Louis, life at Versailles would be not only about power and architecture, but also about pleasure, intrigue, and the endless pursuit of beauty. The king and his lovers. Though married to Queen Marie-Therese, Louis had countless affairs. His current mistress was a young noblewoman of striking beauty, Louise de la Vallière. Louis XIV adored women, not just for pleasure but for their charm, intelligence, and wit. He loved their elegance, their laughter, and the way they could tease and challenge him. More than anything, women amused him, and he loved them for it. A king's appetite. Louis XIV had an insatiable sexual appetite. If one of his mistresses took too long to undress, he would sometimes amuse himself with one of her maids, or even a passing servant in the corridor of Versailles. He approached love the same way he approached everything else, with intensity, energy, and absolute confidence. The role of a royal mistress. In France, it was expected that a king should have a mistress. It was seen as a symbol of the nation's vitality. A century later, when poor Louis XVI failed to take a mistress, the French people mocked him for lacking virility. Louise de la Vallière. Louise de la Vallière was Louis XIV's first official mistress. A lady-in-waiting at court, she was gentle, innocent, and charming, the daughter of a respectable noble family. She adored the king with pure devotion, and her sincerity made her irresistible. She truly convinced him that she loved him not as a monarch but as a man. For the young king, that was exactly what he longed to believe. A young king in love. Louise became deeply important to him. He did love her, and together they had 2 children. The king rewarded her with the title of Duchess, but their relationship was ultimately a youthful romance rather than a lasting passion. Duties of a king. Louis XIV was careful to meet his responsibilities as a husband. His marriage to Queen Marie-Thérèse was crucial to maintaining peace between France and Spain, and he needed to ensure the continuation of his dynasty through legitimate heirs. The Queen and her king. Louis felt a genuine sense of duty toward the Queen. He visited her chambers often, and she would always order a special mass the next day, an event that made the courtiers exchange knowing smiles. As she arrived at the chapel looking particularly pleased, he treated her with politeness and respect, and they had several children together. But Marie-Thérèse lacked the beauty, wit, and charm to truly hold his heart. Acceptance and power. Like most royal women of the time, the Queen accepted her husband's infidelities as part of royal life. The courtiers, though often weary and mosquito-bitten in the swamps of Versailles, also accepted their monarch's nature. The divine king. Louis XIV, like all 17th-century rulers, believed he was chosen directly by God. No one could command him or question his will. From childhood, he was raised to see himself as the sole power in France, a belief that made him not arrogant, but utterly certain of his divine purpose and destiny. A living God. Louis XIV believed himself to be almost divine, a living God on earth. Nothing pleased him more than being the center of attention. Raised in an age obsessed with theater and spectacle, the young king took dancing lessons that completely transformed his confidence. The Dancing King. Louis became an accomplished performer. He loved participating in elaborate court ballets, dazzling the audience with his elegance and grace. His contemporaries were amazed by him. Tall, strikingly handsome, with long golden hair and a youthful, angelic face, his mother, Anne of Austria, called him God-given, and many at court agreed. Becoming the Sun King. Louis adored dressing up, not merely for amusement, but as a carefully constructed image of royal power. He chose the Greek god Apollo as his role model, the deity of the sun, light, and harmony. The symbol was a perfect fit. The sun illuminates everything, giving life, yet it also dominates all beneath it. Everything exists in its orbit. The title Sun King began as royal propaganda, but over time it became his true identity. The vision for Versailles. By now, the grand remodeling plans for Versailles were ready. Louis wanted his palace to inspire awe and admiration, to shock the world with its magnificence. His architect Louis Laval presented an impressive design, but it came with a major flaw. It required demolishing the original hunting lodge. Louis refused, preserving the past. For the king, the old chateau held sentimental value. It was his father's home, a link to his childhood. Louis XIV ordered the architect to preserve it and start again from scratch. While Laval returned to the drawing board, Louis XIV turned his focus to the gardens. Building paradise. He envisioned vast, breathtaking landscapes, ornamental lakes, tree-lined avenues, and fountains that seemed to dance in the sunlight. But the site was far from ideal. The area was enclosed by hills, and the local trees were nothing like the majestic species he desired. The king's gardener. To realize his dream, Louis turned to André Lenotre, the most celebrated landscape designer of the age. Versailles would become his greatest challenge. Yet the Sun King was impatient. He didn't want to wait decades for trees to grow. He wanted paradise now, a kingdom replanted. The solution was both ambitious and extraordinary. Full-grown trees were uprooted from across France and transported to Versailles. Ingenious horse-drawn machines were invented to carry these massive trees over rough roads. all to satisfy the king's vision of instant glory. Life at court. While construction was paused, Louis XIV ordered Laval to transform the interiors of Versailles. On his inspection tours, the king was accompanied by his court and by his mistress, Louise de la Vallière, but the young duchess had a rival, the rise of a new mistress. Louis XIV soon grew bored with Louise. She lingered at court heartbroken, hoping to win him back, but she never did. The king, surrounded by beauty and power, had endless choices. Power itself was an aphrodisiac, and a crown even more so. Madame de Montespan. His new favorite was Madame de Montespan, one of the most beautiful women in France. Elegant, spirited, and passionate, she adored everything luxurious: jewels, fine clothes, exquisite food, and lavish gardens. But above all, she loved pleasure. And so did Louis XIV. Together, they were a perfect match. A king and mistress united by desire, ambition, and the glittering world of Versailles. The perfect partner for a king. Madame de Montespan was everything Louis XIV desired in a companion. She knew how to organize magnificent feasts and grand entertainments that dazzled the court. Beautiful, witty, and sophisticated, she embodied the elegance Louis wanted his court to reflect. Her charm was so legendary that even foreign ambassadors claimed she added to the myth of the Sun King himself. The politics of pleasure. But the king's celebrations were not just about indulgence. Behind the fireworks and festivities lay a calculated display of political power. Louis XIV was transforming Versailles into the most influential and fashionable court in all of Europe. The spectacle of Versailles. The parties at Versailles were beyond imagination. Extravagant affairs that historians have described as pagan festivals. There were fireworks, gondola rides along the Grand Canal, open-air balls with thousands of guests dancing under the stars, and spectacular performances featuring over 100 dancers choreographed by Lully. Every detail radiated splendor. A theater of power. These grand festivities served a purpose. They reminded both the French nobility and all of Europe that the King of France reigned supreme, not just in politics and war, but in art, music, and culture. Versailles was becoming not merely a palace, but a symbol of royal perfection. The fall of Louise de la Vallière. Louis's former mistress, Louise de la Vallière, finally abandoned hope of winning back the king's love after years of heartbreak and neglect. She chose to retire to a convent, leaving behind the children she had borne him. She knew they would be well cared for, and her guilt turned instead into repentance, a life of penance. Inside the convent, Louise embraced an austere life of prayer and sacrifice. Her hair was cut, her fine clothes replaced by a coarse habit. She devoted herself to fasting and repentance, eventually earning a reputation for holiness. In solitude, she found the peace she had never known at court. A palace becomes a kingdom. As Louis XIV spent more time at Versailles, he decided to move his entire government there. To make space for the growing number of officials, architect Louis Laval proposed a bold plan to keep the original hunting lodge intact but surrounded on three sides with vast new wings. The birth of the envelope. This new design, known as the envelope, preserved the old chateau within a magnificent new palace facade. Laval also built grand pavilions for the king's ministers, turning Versailles into a fully functioning seat of royal power. The political and administrative heart of France. A monumental undertaking. The scale of the construction was immense. At its peak, more than 40,000 laborers worked on site. The work was dangerous. Scaffolds collapsed, tools broke, and many workers lost their lives. Safety regulations were non-existent, and laborers worked both day and night to meet the king's impossible deadlines. Hidden tragedies. Those who worked high up, the roofers and carpenters, faced the greatest risks. Deaths were common, and to avoid lowering morale, bodies were quietly removed under the cover of darkness. For every gleaming marble column or gilded hall, unseen lives were sacrificed to Louis's dream of glory. The Queen and the Mistress. Meanwhile, Madame de Montespan continued to reign as the king's favorite. Though still married, she spent nearly all her time with Louis, and was treated with unmatched privilege. Her suite contained 20 lavishly decorated rooms, nearly twice as many as those of the Queen herself. At Versailles, even the king's affections were a matter of royal hierarchy. The luxuries of Madame de Montespan. The rooms of Madame de Montespan's apartment were lavishly decorated, filled with art, silks, and gilded furniture. The king spent much of his time there, and among the many luxuries was something extraordinary for the period: a private bathroom. It was said that Louis and Madame de Montespan spent many joyful hours together in that intimate retreat. Jealousy and devotion. Despite her rank and privileges, Montespan found it difficult to share Louis even with his wife. She wasn't truly jealous of the queen. She knew that she possessed the king's real affection. But she was fiercely possessive when it came to his other mistresses. Whenever new rivals appeared, her temper flared. Some said Louis XIV secretly enjoyed her jealousy, seeing it as proof of her devotion, and she certainly made sure he knew it whenever she suspected him of straying. A confrontation at Versailles. While Louis XIV devoted close attention to the construction at Versailles, one of his inspection visits took a dark turn. A grieving mother, furious over the death of her son who had perished on the site, confronted the king directly. She shouted at him without fear, demanding justice. Louis XIV was stunned, not used to hearing such raw emotion, and reportedly asked, "Was that directed at me?" Guards immediately removed the woman, and she was taken away to be punished. Her defiance, though short-lived, was a rare moment of truth in the king's carefully staged world. Lenotre's grand design. Meanwhile, André Lenotre's visionary landscaping plans were finally taking shape. Louis's dream of creating the most magnificent palace and gardens in Europe was slowly becoming reality. Lenotre's genius lay in his ability to redesign the natural landscape, dividing it into precise geometric patterns that created vast outdoor rooms. Each space was then furnished with fountains, statues, and intricate flower beds, turning the gardens into a living extension of the palace itself. A palace of power. The grand envelope around the old hunting lodge was complete. The king's ministers had moved into their new apartments, and for the first time, Louis XIV began to govern France directly from Versailles. He soon declared that the palace would become his permanent residence, and insisted that the nobility take up residence there as well. Control through splendor. For Louis, the great nobles were essential to his kingship. Their presence added prestige and splendor to his court. But their constant proximity also meant control. This was a monarchy where all decisions, rewards, commands, and favors flowed directly from the king. If nobles wanted power, wealth, or influence, they had to earn it by pleasing him. Expanding Versailles. The move to house all the nobles meant further expansion, which alarmed the king's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. The costs of the palace were already astronomical, but Louis was determined. He wanted his nobles at Versailles, where he could watch them closely and ensure their loyalty. His message was clear. You do not need to rebel to gain favor, you simply need to serve me here. A new vision takes shape. Before the project was finished, the original architect, Louis Lavaux, passed away. His successor, Jules Hardouin-Mansart, brought a new vision to Versailles. He proposed extending the palace with 2 immense wings to house princes and courtiers, transforming the site into a royal city of its own. His most daring idea was a grand gallery lined entirely with mirrors, a breathtaking innovation that would later become one of Versailles' most iconic features. The price of perfection. Yet even Mansart's brilliance could not solve every problem. Construction delays, ballooning costs, and chaos on site became constant frustrations. The elegant images of Versailles as a serene paradise were far from reality. Beneath the gold and marble, the palace was noisy, dirty, and perpetually under construction. A magnificent dream built amid endless disorder. Versailles behind the illusion. The elegant paintings and engravings of Versailles show a place of perfect order, where courtiers glide gracefully through marble halls. In truth, it was a giant construction site. Work began at 6 every morning, filling the air with dust and the pungent smell of wet plaster that clung to clothes and hair. The courtiers complained endlessly. It was, in many ways, just like modern renovations, only on a royal scale. Life in a palace of chaos. Inside the crowded palace, everyone was constantly maneuvering for larger rooms, better locations, or simply a place closer to the king. Lesser courtiers tried to escape their cramped attics and move nearer to the royal apartments. At night, mattresses were rolled out across the floors, as servants, soldiers, and guards slept wherever they could find space. Hygiene, however, was almost non-existent. Chamber pots were rare, and many servants relieved themselves in corridors or stairwells. Beneath all the splendor, the gold, the perfume, the silks, Versailles often smelled more like a stable than a palace. Fashion and power. Despite the discomfort, nobles endured it all for proximity to the king. Louis's passion for magnificence extended to every detail, especially his wardrobe. He wore only the finest fabrics and expected his courtiers to follow suit when his hair began to thin. He popularized the trend for grand wigs, Every lace cuff, jeweled button, or pearl placement could determine status or ruin a reputation. Fashion at Versailles became a weapon of survival. Louis himself inspired trends with his flamboyant silks, ribbons, and high-heeled shoes, an invention to make up for his modest height. His mistresses also influenced court fashion. Madame de Montespan, for example, designed a daring outfit called la déchevêlée glorieuse, a kind of tunic worn over trousers, created for one very practical reason. It could be removed quickly. Normally, a lady's gown required 2 maids to undo its ties, but the impatient king had no time to wait. Her new design allowed for discretion and speed, the ritual of royal life. As the number of courtiers grew, Louis XIV kept them occupied by turning his daily routines into elaborate ceremonies. Each morning began with le lever du roi, the royal awakening, where the most powerful nobles lined up to help him dress, each eager to hand the king a shirt, a glove, or a shoe. At night, the process reversed with le coucher du roi, the royal bedtime, when courtiers competed for the honor of undressing him. Even mealtimes were transformed into grand performances. Nobles stood and watched as the king dined, waiting for a word, a glance, or a sign of favor. The smallest gesture from Louis XIV could make or break a man's career. The rituals of Versailles may have seemed trivial, but they served a deeper purpose. They kept the nobility busy, obedient, and entirely dependent on their king. The power of image. Versailles was more than a royal residence. It was the living proof that the monarchy had fully reclaimed its authority. At court, flattery became a daily ritual. One nobleman, when asked by Louis about his wife's pregnancy, replied without hesitation, "When your majesty wishes it." That summed up life at Versailles. Everything, even birth itself, revolved around the king. Louis turned his palace into a stage for France itself. It wasn't only about housing thousands of courtiers and officials. Versailles was meant to be a showcase for French industry and craftsmanship, designed to rival and surpass the elegance of Italy. Then the world's capital of taste. Every tapestry, every gilded panel, every piece of furniture celebrated not only Louis XIV, but the supremacy of French art, the manufacture of glory. Louis had a genuine love for luxurious materials and exquisite design, but his magnificence was also carefully planned. Behind his public image stood a team of intellectuals, artists, and writers dedicated entirely to shaping how the king was seen. It was a new kind of royal propaganda, systematic, intellectual, and astonishingly effective. Among the most influential members of this artistic circle was Charles Lebrun, the king's official painter. Lebrun and his team created a visual mythology around Louis, portraying him as a modern Jupiter or Apollo, a divine conqueror radiating light and order. Every ceiling, every canvas told the same story. France under Louis was the new Rome, the tireless king. Behind the splendor, the king himself was extraordinary. His image might have been carefully orchestrated, but his energy was very real. Louis hunted up to 3 times a day, held multiple council meetings, and still found time for his romantic pursuits. He seemed to operate on pure willpower, a man driven by the conviction that glory was his destiny, the gardens of ambition. Louis's hunger for grandeur extended beyond walls and paintings into the open air of Versailles Gardens. André Lenotre transformed the landscape into a vision of controlled perfection. But there was one problem even the Sun King couldn't command: water. Versailles stood on dry ground, far from natural rivers. Yet the king demanded hundreds of fountains, each one shooting water into the sky, to create the illusion of abundance. Gardeners turned the fountains on only when Louis approached, and off again the moment he passed. Engineers tried everything. The gigantic Machine de Marly with its massive water wheels lifting water from the Seine, and later plans for a Roman-style aqueduct. But none of it was enough. The fountains could never all run at once. The Hall of Mirrors. What Versailles lacked in water, it made up for in glass. After 6 years of intense work, architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart and painter Charles Lebrun completed their masterpiece, the Hall of Mirrors. The gallery's endless reflections and natural light created an atmosphere that seemed almost dreamlike, a corridor of power and illusion. The Hall of Mirrors became the beating heart of the palace, a symbol of Louis's brilliance and authority. Versailles was not meant to be admired in fragments, not just the mirrors or the gardens or the canal, but as a perfect whole. It was both the king's home and his monument. To understand Versailles was to understand Louis himself, a ruler determined to assert his power and preserve his glory for all time. A king on stage, Louis ruled through spectacle, Versailles became his perfect stage, a living theater where he could perform the duties of kingship before the world. No other setting could have better reflected his vision of royal power. His love affair with the palace lasted longer than any romance in his life. The fall of Madame de Montespan. After 14 years, 9 pregnancies and 7 children, Madame de Montespan's beauty and influence began to fade. Her figure softened, her temper worsened, and her habits of drinking and gambling became impossible to ignore. As her jealousy grew, she became desperate to keep Louis's attention, but her clinginess only drove him further away. At the same time, the king himself was changing. A man once driven by passion was now turning toward faith. Adultery with a married woman had become not just scandalous but sinful, and Louis began to fear that his lifestyle was endangering both his throne and his soul. The rise of Madame de Maintenon. Louis found comfort in a very different woman. Madame de Maintenon, governess to his illegitimate children, she was calm, intelligent, and deeply religious, qualities that appealed to the aging king. Tireless in her duties, she managed everything from teaching to household repairs, and her quiet strength began to draw his admiration. Slowly she won his heart. The once rejected Montespan was furious. She had underestimated this modest widow, but Louis found Maintenon's serenity irresistible. When Queen Marie-Thérèse died, he was free to marry again, and though Maintenon was a commoner, she convinced him that together they could save his soul. Their marriage took place in secret, a private morganatic ceremony witnessed by only a few clergy. It gave Louis the peace of mind to confess, to pray, and to receive communion again. Publicly, he never acknowledged the union, but privately, Maintenon became his wife and his closest confidant. The court of power. With his personal life settled, Louis poured all his energy into Versailles. Court life became ever more rigid and ceremonial, turning the palace into the political and social heart of France. For nobles, an evening in the king's presence, to dance before him or sit at his gaming table, was the highest honor imaginable. Versailles was part high society, part political battlefield. It was both a glittering arena of etiquette and a ruthless marketplace for influence, where whispers carried power and gossip spread like wildfire. They're saying this, they're saying that. These were the phrases that ruled the corridors. Scandal was constant and privacy impossible. To be excluded from court was ruinous. The greatest insult a noble could hear was, "He is a man I never see." Some spent years hoping for just a glance, a nod, a single word from the king. Louis was now the absolute center of French life, admired, feared, and obeyed. The suffering king. But behind the splendor, Louis XIV was human. After decades of health, he developed a painful anal fistula, a potentially fatal condition in the 17th century. The only cure was surgery, which at the time was as dangerous as the disease. Louis XIV ordered it to be done. His doctors created special instruments and practiced the procedure on other patients. Even so, the operation was excruciating. No anesthetic, no guarantee of survival. Yet the king endured it silently, displaying the same composure that had defined his reign. That very night, astonishingly, he held a council meeting. Louis XIV recovered, but his strength was fading. Wars, once his glory, became his burden. France's enemies multiplied, and soon the treasury ran dry. To fund his army, the king even melted down the silver from Versailles. Though he secured peace, the price was humiliation, and the Sun King's brilliance began to dim. The last wars in decline. Only 4 years of peace passed before crisis struck again. The King of Spain died, leaving his vast empire to Louis's young grandson. Accepting the inheritance meant provoking all of Europe. Refusing it meant losing everything to Austria. Louis chose family honor, and with it, another brutal war. The conflict dragged on for 12 exhausting years. France suffered terribly, and even Versailles grew cold and joyless under Madame de Maintenon's influence. Louis abandoned the entertainments he once adored. The palace became a world of silence, ritual, and devotion. Every hour of his day scripted, every move predictable. The twilight of the Sun King. Illness claimed many of his family members, including his beloved son and grandson. Grief and regret haunted the aging monarch. Sometimes, alone in his chamber, he wept for the choices he had made, for the wars that once seemed glorious but had left his country bleeding. At 76, after 72 years on the throne, Louis's body finally began to fail. Gangrene spread from his leg throughout his body. Madame de Maintenon withdrew to a convent, leaving Louis XIV to face his end surrounded by priests. His final act was one of humility. When his 5-year-old great-grandson, the new heir, was brought to his bedside, Louis XIV told him softly, "Be a good king. I have loved war too much." It was a confession and a warning. Through every triumph and tragedy, Louis XIV had shaped the very soul of France. His monuments, his art, and above all Versailles itself became the eternal reflection of his reign. Magnificent, commanding, and unforgettable.